Is compassion a crime?
One of the things that the Cannabis Club helped us out the most with is actually getting the medicine. Before, we would have to go to the beach fronts or places where kids hung out that really weren't reputable. You know, we were kind of out there on our own against the world.
When I was taking the medicine, I was having sharp pains in my stomach. And I smoke a joint and the pains go away.
The first charges I got were later replaced by even more charges. And finally, I'm facing 8 charges of conspiracy, of sales to a DEA undercover agent who filled out all our forms, as well as I'm charged with 1 count of selling to one of the patients, and just basically cultivation of marijuana. But what is this whole thing really about? Basic rights. Rights to health.
I was told by a neurologist that he thinks it would help. And I have smoked marijuana, cannabis, ever since.
Rights to seek treatment for one's own pain and suffering.
I was really happy when the club came along because it gave us an environment where we felt safe in going to get our medicine from Sherry.
But even more fundamental rights to democracy. We voted for this. This is now law. To respect the will of the people. To justice. Failure would result in fear.
Between me and him, yes, it's very, documented and he knows everything, but just on paper, he's not willing to put his name and risk his practice for that.
Forcing tyranny on the people.
Let me tell you, it's going to be a time where marijuana patients aren't going to be treated this way. We can no longer stand up for this action of being policed, pushed down, and bullied.
But what is this really about? Money. $2.3 million worth of medicine taken by the local sheriffs and the DEA. This is actual DEA footage of the raid up in Valley Center of the San Diego Cannabis Caregivers medicine that we work diligently as a cooperative, and their value is $2.3 million for this medicine.
Do we have a keys to it?
We tried our hardest to label the plants for the different patients that were sick and dying, and we left documentation on the walls that these are qualified patients, and we let it know to everyone and anyone who would come and challenge us that we would seek justice and not tolerate anyone taking our medicine. Steve McWilliams was living up there at this farm, trying his most to help patients, but the police felt they were empowered to steal our medicine and become judge and jury. $2.3 million worth of medicine taken, stolen by local police. The Compassionate Use Act, is this the will of the people?
We need to declare a state of emergency. There are people suffering in our community.
Doctors are prescribing it, and now the people asking, where do we get it?
People are suffering. You have a moral and a civil obligation.
We need your moral and financial support.
Hemp for victory.
Your district attorney, Paul Finkst, through Mr. Dave Sonko, his deputy, has charged me with crimes for helping fellow citizens here in San Diego. And I think it's important that I try to document all this and get it down beforehand, before the trial starts, and to let everyone know exactly what happened, and so people can follow it from the community. It's a long tale, but not that complicated. My role specifically and what exactly happened, I think it's important to let everyone know, because this is something that could happen to everyone. Really, this court case has, it's directed against me, but really has nothing to do with me. This, like I say, could happen to anyone. So basically, over time, since the law passed Proposition 215, it became Health and Safety Code 11362.5, which allows people to use and grow medical cannabis for themselves with approval of their doctor. So I've been living in, even though I grew up here in San Diego, after I finished college at SDSU, I decided to move to the Netherlands for political reasons, more that I couldn't really take what was happening here in America. And I went searching for a better place or something better, and I found it in the Netherlands. I've lived in Amsterdam for 5 years, but you know, it's not where I grew up. The weather was terrible, or is terrible, and you know, I wish to live back here with my mom and friends and family. So when the law passed, I felt I could help contribute to the establishment of this new happening. In the Netherlands, I worked with cannabis quite a lot. I opened the first hemp store in Europe. Helped start a medical marijuana foundation there. And when I first went there to Europe, there was little to no information about cannabis as far as its other uses besides recreational. That's why I opened the first hemp store. My hemp store, we didn't sell the smoke. We sold everything but the smoke. And in that way, we became sort of spokespeople for the city, and we did different things, like we hosted the Cannabis Cup, and we integrated hemp into the Cannabis Cup, having a fashion show and international convention, and really try to teach people about the other aspects of the plan. After that time, I kept working towards more political goals, in that I try to specifically help people that were in prison for cannabis. It started a thing called Green Prisoner Release, and we worked on different cases, and the most famous being this couple, the Moorings, Les and Cheryl Moorings, where they were held in the Netherlands for 1.5 years to be extradited back to America. And I think this showed a lot of hypocrisy on the part of the Dutch government, but it also showed the sort of position that they live in one hand, trying to do right by their citizens and not persecuting them for such meaningless crimes, but on the other hand trying to play a New World Order role in appeasing the American government and the powers that be to suppress cannabis. So they sort of live in this in-between stage. But the biggest crime there, even though there's coffee shops everywhere, is that the people don't have the right for medical marijuana. So people that are in the hospital, people that are sick and dying, they don't have cannabis available to them. So, I mean, this is the sort of dichotomy that the U.S. drug policy has placed upon everyone in the world. So I felt consciously obligated when the law passed here to come back and at least contribute somehow, whether that was through my skills of publishing. I published a few newspapers when I was living in Amsterdam, or specifically getting involved in the political aspects of helping people set up foundations for themselves, help people out of prison, and that kind of thing. So when I came back here, that's what I started to do. I was contacting various people, trying to get involved, trying to see that this actually happened, because I feel it's very important for everyone. I don't think it's something that you can just wait until it actually happens. Something happens to you, and you need to have access to cannabis, and then you're complaining that you don't have it.
Found that marijuana really helps my spasticity because I have a spinal cord injury, and at night my legs get really have a lot of spasticity, and marijuana seems to help.
I think it's wiser to be proactive, and since I knew or know so much about cannabis, like I said, I felt consciously obligated to help. So I came back and started to make contact with different people, and we started having weekly meetings. Every week we'd meet and discuss what was happening with the law, trying to encourage each other to contact other people and find out more about the law, and really build up bonds between us as far as interest in finding out the relevance of different applications of cannabis to different diseases, as well as what was happening politically, because it wasn't 100% sure that the government would respect the will of the people. And this was really the main focus since I came back, is whether the government would respect its own people. And so opinion was divided about whether they would do that or not. And whether they did or not was not really relevant to me, because, that is the will of the people, and this is what we were for. So since my degree in school is in political science, and that's what I wish to do in the future, I felt this was a great opportunity for me personally to help other people, but also help myself in getting experience in such a revolutionary sort of undertaking. So we kept meeting week after week and discussing the different aspects of the law, and there was more and more clubs opening up around the state, and they were opening up in different manners as far as how they were organized, their structure, and I felt that was very important. So over the few months, we kept meeting. We met at UCSD at the Che Cafe, and after we had got a good group core of people and patients, we felt that it was necessary to try to find a place so we could really concentrate on doing this kind of work all the time. We were meeting more and more people and getting more and more a sense of urgency to help people, because we were getting in more and more contact with people who needed cannabis.
My name is Anthony Rodriguez. I'm a member of the San Diego Cannabis Caregivers Club. I'm an initial member. I joined last February. I am a patient. I have prostate cancer, incurable. It's in the latter stages. I suffer from a lot of pain in my back, in my ribs, my spine, my neck. I have cranial cancer.
We kept meeting, and finally we found a place in Ocean Beach on Newport Avenue in a little mini mall, a little office in the back of this mini mall right there on Newport. And we felt that it was in our rights to associate and come together. So we opened the place, and We tried to establish rules and guidelines of how to accept other people into this association. And to do that, we looked around the state to see how other people were organizing. And there was mainly two different ways, let's say. And one was like the most famous person, Dennis Perone, who opened up as a sort of sole proprietor, being a quote-unquote caregiver to hundreds or thousands of people. And this seemed to be successful for him. Since January 15th, Judge Garcia ordered that he could reopen, and all the media was there, and upon national television he opened and continued to openly sell and help people. So that was encouraging in one aspect, but the Attorney General, Dan Lundgren, was appealing that decision. And other clubs opened and had been opened before Proposition 215 passed and were organized in other manners. And specifically, Oakland was one that we felt that was probably the best model because they were a cooperative. And the Proposition 215 specifically empowers patients themselves to grow and to consume cannabis. It doesn't really speak of where it comes from and all these different things, or who can help, and really who is a caregiver and all these kind of things. So constitutionally, we felt that every individual can exercise their right as a cooperative. So we felt this was the best way, and we took our guidelines after Oakland. So after we set up these sort of guidelines, and we kept meeting week after week, and every week deliberating what was right, what was wrong, how to conduct ourselves, what was happening with the government as far as different policy perhaps coming out of them, the policy of the federal government. So we were always constantly analyzing this, and over time, through the summer, we moved into that OB store in June, and over the summer we got into contact with the police. We were actually robbed our first weekend in the OB place. I think the police were happy to see us there because one, that they could stop arresting sick and dying people when they saw them and made contact with them. So I think a lot of the police, or the majority of the police, feel that the cannabis laws are unjust and a waste of their time. So specifically when we're talking about sick people, they were happy to see that there was an outlet for them. So over time, more and more police would come and visit our establishment, mostly out of curiosity and word of mouth through their police station. More and more police would come by, and this gave us a sort of sense of security, at least that they knew about us and that they were, if not approve that we were there, that they acknowledged that we were there, and at least they weren't arresting us. So we felt empowered to go further, and therefore we kept our doors open. And there was a whole spectrum, of course, of people who obviously qualified, people who we weren't sure if they qualified, and people who obviously didn't qualify. So it was a big screening project for us to see who qualified and who didn't. And so we took the policy that it wasn't us to say who would qualify. Of course, it was their doctor. So as long as they filled out the forms and saw their doctor, and we could acknowledge that they saw their doctor, then we felt almost obligated to let them in, because, like I said, we're not doctors. We couldn't tell, if someone has severe migraines, or if they have asthma, or different things like that. So we tried to set up the policy to the best that we could. The Compassionate Use Act, is this the will of the people?
We need to declare a state of emergency. There are people suffering in our community.
Doctors are prescribing it, and now the people asking, where do we get it?
People are suffering. You have a moral and a civil obligation.
We need your moral and financial support.
Hemp for victory.
And like I was saying, more and more people were coming, and it became a bit overwhelming. Now my role this whole time was trying to just help keep the group organized, as far as having weekly meetings, trying to document those meetings, keeping them focused. I don't know if people have been involved in various things, but no matter what you try to do in life, it's very hard. Especially when you're dealing with a lot of people with a lot of opinions. And since we were a cooperative and a collective, we try to incorporate everyone's ideas and opinions. And so in one way this was a strength of ours, but in another way it was a weakness in that we didn't move that far as perhaps as far as we could have within contacting the government and different things like that. But we felt we were in our rights and that we didn't really, it wasn't necessarily necessary. So we kept on as a group pushing forward and trying to accept people and integrating them. And I tried to focus my attention on helping the people learn how to grow, how to ingest cannabis in a safer way through vaporization or through eating it or through tinctures. It's a misnomer that you have to smoke cannabis to get its full potential. So a lot of people were coming from, this world of ignorance since there's been no information around cannabis. So I could really see myself helping people quite a bit. And even though I still have my home in the Netherlands, or had it at the time, it was hard for me to go back and just leave all these people. So I kept pushing forward, and during this whole time, as well as I tried to help people that were being imprisoned for cannabis, a lot of people were coming to the club that got tickets.
I recently got busted for marijuana and had a big fight with the DA and the judges and all this stuff, and wound up getting my marijuana back.
Through the media, I was put in contact with Dedrick Fields, who was somewhat of a typical example of how the war on drugs has eroded society to allow people just to fall through the cracks and into jail for life. This man, he was imprisoned for walking down the street and being caught with half a joint in his pocket, and he has HIV, but he also had 2 strikes against him, so he had no Fourth Amendment rights.
The time I spent in jail, I ran into a guy named Dion, and about Proposition 215 that I was aware of, but I wasn't aware of it like Dion was. But I was in jail suffering, and Dion came to my assistance.
So for that, they said he was a drug dealer, and so he spent the first half of '97, about approximately 6 months, in prison.
When I was taking the medicine, I was having sharp pains in my stomach, and I smoke a joint and the pains go away. And it helps me eat, it helps me.
They had already condemned him for life in prison. He was facing 25 mandatory minimum years. So since he had HIV and I felt he qualified, and I tried to contact other lawyers to try to help him. And finally, I was put in contact with Juliana Humphreys from the Public Defender's Office, and convinced her over a long conversation that he deserved at least to be reviewed as far as his case. She decided to take over the case herself. She saw that it was obviously a medical marijuana situation and that he deserved more than he was getting. So with her aid, he got his bail reduced, and we helped the club. We had a couple fundraisers. We came up with his bail. He was put out on bail. And then we tried to give him support in the media and with the club to get prepared for his trial. And with all the attention that we had built up on the trial, right when it came to it, the district attorney suddenly made a 180 turn and said they didn't want to see people like him going to prison, that they didn't want to see sick and dying people going to prison. And this whole time that we were in court, the assistant district attorney, Mr. Allard, was engaged in conversations with myself about knowing about the club and how they were aware of the club and that they were quote-unquote down with the club. So this also gave us confidence, and especially when Dedrick was allowed to go free with no charge. Well, he was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser crime and no time. So they sort of blackmailed him into taking the plea when he was facing, 25 mandatory minimum years versus nothing. So he took the plea, and like I said, this gave us confidence that we were doing the right thing. We had the courts sending us people, and so we had police coming by, so we felt that we were doing the right thing. So as I said, there was more and more people coming constantly, and a good concentration of these people were AIDS victims who lived in the Hillcrest area. So over time, we were approaching almost 100 patients, and the majority of them were from this area. So then we opened a second place to make it easier for them to come to in Hillcrest and Park Boulevard, and right next to University and Park, and next to a few HIV community centers. And from that point, the club just ballooned beyond really that we could handle. And my role in the club increased even more. For one, that we had so many more people coming, and the fact is that the overwhelming majority of them were so sick that they couldn't run the daily routine of the administration of the association. So I found myself even dragged in more and more. And this whole time I had been volunteering. And so, at one point I went back to the Netherlands in September. And when I left, I wouldn't say things totally collapsed, but a lot of things went haywire, especially with the garden. We had our garden totally destroyed, and we lost all our plants, and this was really devastating to a lot of people in the club. So more and more I got sucked into this situation because of just circumstances of seeing these people that I could help, but that they were floundering in their own ignorance and sickness. So I felt more and more obligated to play a bigger role, and to the point where in November I was named the ad hoc director of the club. And I insisted that it would be an ad hoc role because I couldn't see myself doing this forever or a long time, and I felt that it had to be a more established association. It had to be recognized, it had to be insured, it had to have properly salaried people to do it professionally on a long-term basis. So this was my goal, this was my intention, and through November and December, the club only expanded. We went from roughly about 100 members to the end of January to 300 members. And this was screening people very diligently and turning away, the majority of the people that would come. But just that we were in Hillcrest, which is a community with a lot of hospitals and a lot of community clinics and such. So we were getting referred to by a lot of people, and so the club grew almost to the brink of out of control. And we were really hoping to engage ourselves with the city in a more established manner. But every time that we would talk to the district attorney about having meetings and protocols, we got turned away, mainly because they were saying that they had to wait until the litigation with Dedrick Fields was over. And I think this was a bit of a cop-out because they had already pleaded with Dedrick, but in their sort of cruel manner, they didn't sentence him for almost a year. They let it hang for a year, hoping that perhaps he would get tripped up and actually would then end up going to jail. So in this sort of cruel sort of mix that we were in, we were constantly striving to do what we felt was right. We were meeting constantly. We were meeting with other clubs. We attended a statewide meeting in October up in Santa Cruz with all the clubs and distributors, and tried to come up with guidelines and codes of honor, and we all came up with a sort of principles and affirmations, as we called it, that we would be nonprofit, that we would work towards working with community leaders and established agencies. So we, like I said, we tried and tried, but as we went on, we're sort of at the mercy of this black market, which was very precarious and extremely expensive. The price of the top quality medicine that was necessary for so many people is and was more expensive than gold. So this was very draining to see all these sick and dying people suffering needlessly because this is just a plant and we could grow it.
And it's something that can help help a lot of different people, a lot of different injuries, a lot of different aspects, but you can grow it in your own backyard, and I don't see why you should get in trouble for it.
So therefore, we really try to focus our attention on growing and trying to instruct the people to grow their own. And but the problem with that is that most of the people live in some kind of situation that doesn't allow them physically to do it. They don't have the space, they're not allowed to for the landlord or roommates. And then, of course, the other factor is that they're too sick to grow it themselves.
The Compassionate Use Act, is this the will of the people?
We need to declare a state of emergency. There are people suffering in our community.
Doctors are prescribing it, and now the people asking, where do we get it?
People are suffering. You have a moral and a civil obligation.
We need your moral and financial support.
Hemp for victory.
So knowing this, we tried to set up collective gardens for the purpose of supplying our own medicine. And to that end, the club had met a gentleman who had opened his own cannabis club in Valley Center, Steve McWilliams, and we met at different events. He came to our club and actually then joined our club as a member, and we went through a process of dialogue of, you know, how we could try to solve our problems. And over the time in October, we both attended this meeting up in Santa Cruz and felt that it was important that we establish our own supply for these patients. So after discussing and coming to the meetings, we decided to see if we could pursue growing at the Valley Center location, because they were there on 4 to 5 acres, and the owner there was open and sympathetic to allowing this for the patients. So in the best possible manner, we tried to open this collective garden there, and we tried to put names individually at first to each plant, and then tried to grow, frankly, as much as we could to supply the club. To this end, we made an agreement with the lady there, and it was all straightforward, that the patients, these plants belonged to the patients, and that they were theirs, and that they could come visit them. And to this end, we had a couple patients from our club here in Hillcrest even move up there. We had 2 AIDS and cancer victims move up there, and they helped attend this garden. And we would take sort of field trips up there, and people would come visit their plants, and we tried to set it up in a very idealistic way. And our objective was to, you know, build this garden into a manner where it could consistently supply the needs of the patients. Since at this time we were growing into the hundreds of people, we're talking quite a few plants that we'd need to grow to try to satisfy their need. So it was really an open-ended sort of project, in that we couldn't grow fast enough to meet the people's needs. So we made plans with the lady that owns the property and lives there to build a greenhouse, which would be the most efficient way of growing a good supply. So this Valley Center place was a very well-known place. It was on the news as early as October, September. And to this end, we felt that we were again protected, since the police knew about it. They were quoted in the paper about it. They knew what we were doing and who it was going for. But then Steve was taking some plants to another patient who was victimized by the sheriffs in another incident where they went and raided this quadriplegic's home, Steve Bowman, and stole all his plants and all his medicine and all his equipment and left him with nothing. But then in the end felt sorry for him, because he was obviously quadriplegic who was laid out and, you know, obviously needed the stuff. They gave him 3/4 of his 5.5 pounds back to him and said, yes, you are someone who deserves it, and that, you know, that you do have the right to it, but you don't have. They became judge and jury and said, oh, you don't have the right to all this other stuff. And in addition, they didn't file any charges against him, so this left him with no recourse. And this is when they contacted the club, and the club sort of directed them to me, because I dealt with a lot of the legal affairs, and I put them in touch with Mrs. Humphreys, who let them know that they couldn't really do anything because the police hadn't filed charges. So basically they had stolen his stuff and he had no recourse. So in the light of this medical emergency, we tried to help Mr. Bowman, and the only way we could know how is by giving him some more plants so he could start growing again, so he could meet his own needs. So we initially gave him a few plants, and then Steve was bringing him 11 more plants. And this is when he was stopped at the border checkpoint way out there past Valley Center on his way to Warner Springs. And from this arrest, where they stopped him to question him whether he had the right or not to have these plants, which Steve produced his medical documentation. From this, they believed they had the right to go raid the Valley Center property where our plants were. So they did this overnight. They went there at 2:30 in the morning without a warrant and searched the property. The two AIDS and cancer patients who lived there thought they were thieves. They were not in uniform. They went out there screaming at them, saying, "We're going to call the police." And that's when they informed them they were the police, and that they said, "Do you have a search warrant?" They said they didn't. So they said they were going to call the media. At that point, they ordered them back in their house, and the police eventually left the property and came back in the morning, 7:30 in the morning, and served a search warrant, and then suddenly felt empowered to be judge, jury over hundreds of people's medicine, and proceeded to kill all the plants that were there. Now the real question, so that's the gist of the whole thing. At least at the first part. So the question really coming up in my trial is whether all these actions that I just described to you were lawful or were they unlawful. And so I feel this is a sort of cowardice position of the district attorney, because really I think the powers that be in our community realized after what these renegade sort of sheriffs did out there, they realized that they had sort of messed up.
The Compassionate Use Act, is this the will of the people?
We need to declare a state of emergency. There are people suffering in our community.
Doctors are prescribing it, and now the people asking, where do we get it?
People are suffering. You have a moral and a civil obligation.
We need your moral and financial support.
Hemp for victory.
And so when it came to Steve's, Mr. McWilliams' trial date, we went down there as a group with the media, with the same van filled with more plants, approximately, say, 20 plants, and no charges were filed against Mr. McWilliams. So to us, this wasn't good enough. Just we didn't want to end up like the Bowmans with, just them stealing from us and just no recourse. So we went straight at that moment and marched to Mr. Fink's office and had a protest there and said that we're not going to take this as an answer. We want our plants back. And the district attorney took an hour or two to come up with some comments to the media saying that perhaps they would file some charges, maybe they won't file some charges. And interestingly enough, at the same time, the police and the marshals had surrounded our van down at between the courthouse down on the street. And so then all the patients and the media proceeded to march down there to show them that, hey, we are patients and that we do qualify and you can't take our plants like you did before. So we went down there in front of all the media and everything. The police looked at everyone's records and notes from their doctor, and within 10-15 minutes had let us go. So this shows a bit of the hypocrisy and the lack of policy from our government, and specifically our city and county councils, that they haven't come up with any sort of guidelines to help the police officers who are generally sympathetic but put in the middle when it comes to these situations.
I was caught on a boat. The officer that caught me told me that he would give me my marijuana back if I would somehow adjudicate myself through the court system, in which I did. I went to court 3 or 4 times to talk to people about the marijuana situation at hand. After the Judge Kenshiro here in San Diego, ordered my release of property, which was the bag of marijuana that the officer took, I felt confident that I could grow and be able to smoke marijuana freely in my house without regard to anybody or anything else because of the law that's stated here in California. Now, a few months shortly thereafter being adjudicated, the NTF, Officer McWilliams, and his partner, along with Steve Reed, showed up to my house to confiscate, convict me right then and there of having marijuana on my premises. I had 46 plants which were mostly undeveloped. I had a few developed, quite developed, nicely plants, I should say. But the fact of the matter is these people knew that I had marijuana on the property and that I was also a medical marijuana patient. And I don't know if anybody out there is ever going to see this and if it's worth anything, but let me tell you, it's going to be a time where marijuana patients aren't going to be treated this way. We can no longer stand up for this action of being policed, pushed down, and bullied.
We decided to pursue a lawsuit against the sheriffs and the county council, and the county and people of San Diego, youth. So we had our lawyer sent sort of threatening letters to the powers that be, the sheriff, the head of different departments, and with no response 6 weeks later, or I should say, then we even sent our lawyer down there to meet with the district attorney, and nothing really came from the meeting other than they wanted to investigate everyone and wanted to bring everyone in to possibly put charges on them. So this wasn't acceptable to us, so at that time we felt it was wise to close the clubs under this sort of threat from the district attorney and wait and see sort of attitude. And less than 3 or 4 weeks later, I found out that I was being charged via television. I had been charged with selling to an undercover officer, DEA agent, in August of the previous year. So I feel their response is a way to try to intimidate myself and the other people within this association not to come forward and demand justice for the actions that the sheriffs took upon us up there at Valley Center and took our plants. And I think that this is normal policy for the district attorney here to sort of intimidate people into not following through with their rights. But in such a case that is so overwhelmingly large and implicates everyone in the county, because at some point everyone's going to become sick and everyone's going to die. Everyone's going to eventually come across some kind of disease or accident, if not directly towards themselves, towards a loved one, a neighbor, or a friend. So in the end, if you have no rights to help these people, then that says a lot towards your own life. So really, that's why I say this case has really nothing to do with me. It only has to do with what I was trying to do idealistically, and that's to help people. And if in society we can't help people, then what kind of society do we have? And especially when you see these people sick and dying at the time. Now, for example, at this protest that we had, or one of the protests that we've had downtown, there's the man Richard Santemeyer, who you might remember from the news, who came up and hugged me when I was giving it away downtown. And he was making quite a scene that day, because he was telling the media and the people of San Diego that sure enough, that these people had stole his medicine, and he was sick and dying, and his last days would be even more filled with more suffering because of the actions of our government. And sure enough, about 6 weeks ago, in late August, Mr. Santemeyer died. So this is only just one example of the many. So I think it's important that people follow this case, because it's not necessarily the actions that were specifically done by ourselves. I mean, we were in front of the television and in front of the media the whole time, trying to help people. It's really the reaction of our government. This is what really, I feel, what is going to be tried. And you, the people, should be aware, because you're going to suffer the consequences. So this is hopefully going to be a wake-up call for people to see their government, and this will expose the tyranny that they've been placing on patients, even not directly going around and perhaps, knocking down doors, but instilling fear in the doctors, the lawyers, and the patients themselves to help themselves. They're afraid to grow. They're afraid to find a place and to get cannabis. And really, you're talking about, your grandmothers, about people in society that don't have the means to find this stuff. And really, this defines our own society. So I really feel it's important that attention be brought to it. Hence, I've made this video, and I hope as you listen to the whole documentation here, you will get a sense of urgency that things have to change now. And believe me, when I win this case, the patients, we will seek justice, and we will get justice.
The Compassionate Use Act, is this the will of the people?
We need to declare a state of emergency. There are people suffering in our community.
Doctors are prescribing it, and now the people asking, where do we get it?
People are suffering. You have a moral and a civil obligation.
We need your moral and financial support.
Hemp for victory.
In conclusion, I feel that I've shown you the majority of the reality of the situation, and that it's important that that justice is found in this case and that the property, those plants, the medicine for the patients is returned.
As far as I'm concerned, the cops had no rights to, the cops, federal agents, whoever, had no rights to take that. What they did, what they confiscated in that raid, and I would want it back.
And we set a precedence for law enforcement, for the justice system, and for police, and a proper policy for our community that we could follow so other people won't have to suffer what I and the people around me and the patients and my family and friends have had to suffer, because this is wrong and what we were doing was right. And if the court system or our district attorney can try to turn this around, then I think that says more about the district attorney and more about society than it does myself or the needs of the patients. And if we don't try to help our fellow man and neighbor in compassion, then what is society? What is the purpose? And what's the point?
Well, with 215 that went through, we thought it was going to be safe, that we weren't going to have to worry, be criminal. Yeah. We thought it passed where we wouldn't be criminals anymore. And with them fighting us, the Cannabis Club, with the 215 and that's not what people voted for. It's supposed to make it legal for people with AIDS and MS, other things wrong with them, for pain and cancer. People have to live in a bad enough world and still have to, on top of that, pain that medicine don't cure. I mean, pills don't take it away.